She was 49 years old. She had exactly $317.40 left to her name, and she had just learned that 23 years of her marriage had been a lie told in a quiet, patient voice across the dinner table every single night. That was the arithmetic of Faye Renfro's life on the morning everything changed. A wedding ring she no longer wore, sitting in a coffee mug on the windowsill of a rented room. A bank balance she had counted twice, because the first time she had not believed it, and a number of years she could not stop adding up, the way you keep pressing on a bruise to see if it still hurts. It still hurt. Before we go any further, if stories like this one mean something to you, take 1 second to hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel, into kitchens and trucks and night shifts all over the world. Now, let me tell you about Faye. Faye Renfro was the kind of woman people forgot to thank. Not because she did little, but because she did so much of it so quietly that it disappeared into the background of other people's lives, the way the hum of a refrigerator disappears until the day it stops and the silence wakes you at 2 in the morning. She had spent her whole adult life being the hum. The one who remembered the birthdays and packed the lunches and sat up with the sick child and called the insurance company and waited on hold for 40 minutes without complaining because somebody had to, and it was always going to be her. She had a low voice and steady hands and a habit of listening that made people tell her things they had not planned to say. Strangers in waiting rooms, cashiers near the end of a long shift. Once, a man at a bus stop in the rain who told her he was thinking of not going home, and she had stood there with him until the rain let up and he changed his mind and got on the bus. She never found out his name. She thought about him sometimes anyway. She had grown up outside Fort Smith, Arkansas, in a house that smelled of fried onions and cigarette smoke, the youngest of 4, the one who got the hand-me-downs and the leftover attention. Her father drove a delivery route for a bakery and was gone before light and home after dark. And her mother worked the line at a poultry plant and came home with her hands raw and her patience gone. And Faye learned early that the way to be loved in that house was to be no trouble. So she became no trouble. She got good grades nobody checked. She kept her room clean. She learned to read a room the way other children learned to read books, scanning for the signs of an argument before it started, slipping out of the way, going small, going quiet. It is a strange and lonely skill, the skill of taking up less space, and the world rewards it for a while and then forgets you because of it. She married Lonnie Cruz when she was 26. He was a heating and cooling man with an easy laugh and big hands, and a way of filling a doorway when he came home that, at the beginning, had felt like safety. He could fix anything mechanical, and he liked to be thanked for it. And Faye was good at thanking people, so for a long time it worked. They had no children, not for lack of wanting, just for the quiet ordinary grief of a body that would not, and they had folded that sorrow away the way they folded everything away, without talking about it, and gone on. She kept the books for his business. She answered the phone, scheduled the jobs, chased the customers who didn't pay, sat at the little desk in the bare room until 11 at night reconciling invoices while he slept. For 23 years, she was the reason the lights stayed on. She did not think of it as a sacrifice. She thought of it as a marriage. She found out the way people always find out, by accident, by a phone left face up on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower, a message arriving with a name she didn't recognize, and a tone she recognized instantly. She did not pick the phone up. She did not have to. She stood in her own kitchen with her hands flat on the cool laminate counter, and she understood all at once and without drama that the woman had not been a mistake or a slip or a moment of weakness. The messages went back years. There was a whole life in that phone, a parallel life, lived in the spaces Faye had filled with bookkeeping and waiting and being no trouble. He had taken her quiet for permission. He had built a second house in the silence she kept so carefully swept. When he came out of the shower, toweling his hair, she said only one thing. She said, "How long?" And he told her, because he was tired of carrying it, the way liars get tired and mistake their tiredness for honesty. 11 years. 11 of the 23. She did the math standing right there. She had been alone in that marriage longer than some people stay married at all. She did not scream. She had used up her screaming a long time ago, on a childhood she rarely talked about, and there was nothing left in the chamber. She packed a bag that night, the same way she did everything, efficiently without fuss, and she drove to a motel off the interstate. and lay on top of the covers with her shoes on and stared at the ceiling and felt, underneath the grief, a thing she had not expected. Relief. The terrible, guilty relief of a person who has finally been allowed to put down a weight she did not know she was carrying. The divorce was not a war because Lonnie did not fight. He didn't have to. The business was in his name. The house was in his name. The truck and the savings and the good credit were all in his name. Because she had bet who kept the books, and she had never thought to put herself on the deeds. Because that is what trust looks like, right up until the moment it looks like a mistake. Her lawyer, a tired woman in a strip mall office, told her gently that she would walk away with very little. And she did. She walked away with her clothes, a box of kitchen things, the car that was old enough to be hers free and clear, and $317.40, which was what was left in the one account that had her name on it, an account she had opened years ago and forgotten, with a balance built out of birthday checks and coffee can change. $317.40, 49 years old, 23 years gone. That was where Faye Renfro stood when the letter came. It arrived at the rented room she had taken above a laundromat in Fort Smith, a single room with a hot plate and a window that looked out on a parking lot where she lay awake at night, listening to the dryers tumble below her like a sea that never reached the shore. The envelope was thick, official, from a law office in a town she had never heard of, Pell Hollow. She turned it over twice before she opened it, the way you handle a thing you suspect might be a bill you can't pay. It was not a bill. It was a notice that she was the sole surviving heir of one Verna Mae Renfro, who had died on the 11th of February at the age of 99, and who had left to her great-niece Faye the entirety of her estate. Faye sat down on the edge of the bed. She knew the name the way you know the name of a town you drove through once as a child. Verna, her father's aunt. A figure at the very edge of family memory mentioned rarely and always the same way with a small shake of the head. Verna who never married. Verna who lived alone way back up in the hills. Verna who ran the telephone for some little nowhere place and never came to a single funeral or wedding or Christmas, who sent a card sometimes in a slanted hand and otherwise might as well have been a rumor. Faye had met her exactly once, she thought, when she was perhaps 6, a tall, straight old woman on a porch, who had looked at her a long time and said something Faye could no longer remember, and then had not been spoken of again for 40 years. The family story, told without malice but without warmth, was that Verna was cold, selfish, a woman who had chosen a switchboard over a family and gotten exactly the lonely old age she deserved. And now this cold and selfish woman had left Faye everything she had. It did not make sense. That was the first thing Faye felt, sitting on the edge of that bed with the letter shaking slightly in her hand. It contradicted everything she had ever been told. Verna had not known her. Verna had not loved her. Verna had not, by every account Faye had ever heard, loved anyone. And yet here, in the careful language of the law, was a dead woman reaching across 99 years and a lifetime of silence to put her whole life into the hands of a great niece she had met once on a porch. There was a second page. It was a photocopy of a handwritten note, and the handwriting was the same slanted hand Faye half remembered from the long Ago cards. It said only this: give it to Faye. She is the one who will understand, and under that the date, written the previous autumn, a few months before the old woman died. She is the one who will understand. Faye read it 4 times. She did not understand. That was the whole trouble. She did not understand any of it. But somewhere under the confusion, in the same quiet place where the relief had lived, something turned over and looked up like an animal that has heard, very far off, a sound it has been waiting its whole life to hear. The estate, the letter said, consisted principally of a parcel of land and a structure in the unincorporated community of Pell Hollow, in the Ozark Hills of west central Arkansas. The structure was described, in the flat language of the county assessor, as a former telephone exchange building. Condition: poor. Assessed structural value, $0. $0. They had given the building a value of nothing at all. Faye looked at that 0 for a long time. She knew what a 0 meant. She had spent 23 years keeping books, and she knew that a 0 was not always an ending. Sometimes a 0 was just the place where someone with a calculator and a deadline had stopped looking. She had been valued at 0 herself, more or less, by a man who kept his real ledger somewhere she was never allowed to see. She did not entirely trust the zeros that other people assigned. She put the letter in her bag. She did not sleep that night, and not because of the dryers. In the morning, she filled the old car with gas she could not really spare, and she drove south and west into the hills, following a road that left the interstate, and then left the highway and then left the pavement, climbing into country so folded and green and quiet that her phone lost its signal and did not find it again. The hills closed around her like cupped hands. The creeks ran clear and cold over limestone the color of old bone. She passed a church with a hand-lettered sign, and a cemetery where the stones leaned, and a feed store with two men on the porch who lifted two fingers off the rail in the small grave salute of the rural South, and a low concrete bridge over a creek the map called Caney. And then the road climbed one last time, and the trees opened and she was in Pell Hollow. It was not a town. It was the memory of one. A general store with a closed sign that looked permanent. A scatter of houses up the hollows. Wood smoke standing from one or two chimneys even in the mild spring air. A volunteer fire shed with a single bay. Maybe 150 people, she would learn later, spread out across miles of ridge and bottom, the survivors and the stayers of a place the rest of the country had finished with decades ago. And at the center of it, on a small rise where two gravel roads met, on the one piece of ground in the whole hollow that could see in every direction, stood the telephone exchange. It was a small building, single story, maybe 30 feet by 20, built of native stone up to the windowsills and clapboard above, with a steep tin roof gone the soft rust red of long weather. A wooden sign over the door, the paint nearly gone, still held the ghost of letters. Pell Hollow Telephone Exchange. There was a porch, sagging on one end. There were tall windows, 6 of them, 4 panes cracked, the rest wavy and old and catching the afternoon light. And there was, running from a pole at the road, a great fan of wire, dozens and dozens of old open lines, most of them down now, drooping into the brush, but a few still strung taut between the building and the pole and the ridge, as if the building were a thing held in place by threads, or a thing still, faintly, reaching out. Faye parked in the gravel and turned off the engine, and sat there in the ticking silence and looked at the building her dead. Great-aunt had left her, and her first clear thought, the kind of thought you are almost ashamed of, was that the assessor had been generous. $0 looked from here like an overestimate. The porch was failing. The chimney had lost its cap. A storm sometime had torn a sheet of loose and curled it back like the lid of a tin can, and rain had gotten in for who knew how many years. It was by every reasonable measure a ruin, a teardown, a tax bill in the shape of a building. She got out anyway. The gravel crunched under her shoes, loud in the quiet. Somewhere down the hollow a dog barked twice and gave it up. The air smelled of wet stone and cedar and the green mineral smell of the creek, and under it, faint, the smell of old creosote from the wire pole, a smell she did not have a name for but that her body somehow knew. She climbed the 2 stone steps to the porch, and the wood gave a little under her weight but held, and she put her hand on the door, which was not locked, had perhaps not been locked in years, and she pushed it open. And she stood in the doorway and forgot, for a moment, how to breathe. The whole front of the room was a wall of machinery, and it was the most beautiful machine she had ever seen. It rose nearly to the ceiling, a tall cabinet of dark oak grown black with age and oil, and its face was a vast field of small brass holes, hundreds of them, arranged in neat ranks like the windows of a city seen at night. In front of the holes ran a shelf, and on the shelf in 2 long rows sat the cords, dozens of pairs of them, each one tipped with a brass plug, each one weighted somewhere inside the cabinet so that it would retract and lie ready, and above each pair a small key and a tiny lamp. There was a wooden chair on rollers, worn pale and smooth on the arms, set before the board the way a chair is set before a piano. There was a headset on a hook, the leather of its band cracked. There were handwritten labels beside the brass holes, hundreds of tiny labels in faded ink, and on each one a name. Not a number, a name? Stills, Maberry, Boatwright, Renfro, Frawley, the whole hollow, the living and the long dead, written in a careful slanting hand beside the holes where their voices had once arrived. Faye walked into the room slowly. Dust lay over everything, soft and gray, undisturbed except for one thing she did not notice yet. The floor was wide pine, worn into a pale path from the door to the chair, the path of one woman's feet walked 10,000 times over 41 years. There was a small iron cot in the corner with a folded wool blanket, because the operator had to sleep where the calls were, and the calls did not keep office hours. There was a pot-belly stove, and a coffee pot on it gone to rust, and a shelf of mismatched mugs. There was a window above the board that looked out over the whole hollow, every road, every roof, so that the woman who sat in that chair could see the place she was listening to, could watch the wood smoke and the headlights and the weather coming over the ridge, while the voices of her neighbors came in through the brass. It was not a ruin. The roof had failed and the porch had sagged and the assessor had written his 0, but the room itself, the heart of it, was intact. It had been kept. Someone had folded that blanket. Someone had hung that headset on its hook. Someone had, before they left it the last time, set the cords in their 2 neat rows and pushed the chair in square to the board. The way you leave a thing when you mean to come back to it, or when you mean for the next person to find it ready. Faye sat down in the worn wooden chair. It rolled a little under her and then held. She put her hands on the shelf in front of the board, in the 2 worn places where another woman's hands had rested for 41 years, and the wood was smooth and cool under her palms, and she felt, in a way she could not have explained to anyone, that she had come home to a house she had never lived in. She did not yet know what the building was. She thought she did. She thought it was an old machine in an old room, a piece of dead technology in a dying town, a 0 on a county form. She did not yet know that she was sitting in the seat of a 41-year vigil, or that the dust she had not disturbed in the corner by the board hid a thing that would unmake every story her family had ever told her about the cold old woman who chose a switchboard over a family. She did not yet know about the ledger. She knew only that her hands fit the worn places in the shelf, as if they had been waiting for her, and that for the first time and longer than she could remember, sitting in a dead exchange in a forgotten hollow, she did not feel like she was taking up too much space. She drove down to the general store, which turned out not to be entirely closed, and found a man named Royce behind the counter, the unfortunate clerk and keeper of Pell Hollow, a heavy-set man with reading glasses and a transistor radio playing a ball game low. When she told him who she was, he set down what he was holding and looked at her over the glasses for a long moment, and something moved in his face that she could not read. "You're Verna's people," he said. It was not quite a question. Her great niece, Faye said. She left me the exchange. Royce nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had wondered about. He said the county would be glad to be shut of the tax bill, that the building had been a problem for the assessor for years, that nobody in the hollow could afford to buy it, and nobody from outside had ever wanted it. Until lately. And he said that last word, lately, with a small downward turn at the corner of his mouth that Faye filed away without understanding. He told her the power had been cut years ago, but the well still ran, that the roof was the worst of it and the bones underneath were sound, that Verna had paid a man to keep the inside dry as long as she was able, and that lately, again that word, the keeping had fallen to old Odell. "Who's Odell?" Faye asked. Royce took off his glasses. "You'll meet him," he said. "He's up there most evenings, sweeps the step. He won't say much. He can't hear you hardly at all, so don't take it for rudeness." Then Royce looked at her for another long moment and said something she would not understand until much later. He said, "Verna always told us somebody would come for it. We figured she was just being Verna." Then he put his glasses back on and rang up the bread and milk and coffee she bought, with money she could not spare, and he would not take her money for the coffee, and when she protested, he said, "On the house?" for Verna's girl, and turned up the ball game, which was his way of ending the conversation. She went back up to the exchange as the light was going long and gold across the ridges, and the man was there, exactly as Royce had said. He was very old, stooped, in a chambray shirt buttoned to the throat, and he was sweeping the 2 stone steps with a worn broom, sweeping them slowly and carefully, though they hardly needed it, the way a man sweeps a thing not because it is dirty, but because the sweeping is a kind of prayer. He did not hear her car. He did not hear her footsteps on the gravel. She had to come around into his line of sight and stop, and even then he startled, and then he saw her face and went very still. He was looking at her the way Royce had looked at her, the way she would come to recognize over the following weeks. The look of someone seeing a resemblance. He set the broom against the porch post. He raised one hand, slowly, and pointed at her, and then he pointed at the building, and then he made a small gesture, 2 fingers pulling apart and then coming together, that she did not understand. His face was working with something he could not say, or could not say in a way she would hear. Faye said very clearly, so he could read her lips, "I'm Verna's family." And the old man's face broke open into something so full and so undefended that she had to look away. He nodded, again and again. He pointed at her once more, and then he pressed his open hand flat against his own chest, over his heart, and held it there, and his eyes were wet. And Faye, who did not understand a single thing that was happening, understood that this old deaf man had been waiting for her. That he had been sweeping these steps for somebody to come, for years maybe. The way you keep a porch light on for a traveler whose face you do not know. That her arrival was to him the answer to a question she had not known was being asked. His name was Odell. She learned that from Royce, and from the careful block letters Odell could write on the small pad he carried in his shirt pocket, the pad worn soft, half its pages used. He could not hear, and he did not speak, or chose not to, but he could write a little, and he could read lips slowly, and over the days that followed he became her shadow on the hill, arriving each evening as the light went long, doing the small ceaseless tasks of a man tending a thing he loved. He cleared the brush from the failed gutters. He weighted the curled tin against the wind. He showed her where the well pump was and how to prime it. And when she did not understand something, he would take out the soft pad and write, in his careful hand, the simplest possible words. Roof first. Water comes in at west. And once when she stood looking up at the great oak cabinet of the board with its hundreds of named brass holes, not knowing what she was looking at, Odell wrote a single line and handed it to her, and watched her face while she read it. Verna saved my life. Faye looked up from the pad. The old man held her eyes. He did not write anything else that evening. He picked his broom back up and finished sweeping the steps that did not need sweeping. And then he touched 2 fingers to his cap and went off down the hollow in the dusk, a small bent shape on the gravel road. And Faye stood on the porch with his note in her hand and felt the first real crack open in the family story she had carried her whole life. Verna saved my life. Not the cold woman, not the selfish woman who chose a switchboard over a family. Somebody, this gentle old man sweeping her steps in the gloaming, believed with his whole heart that the woman the family had thrown away had saved his life. She began to wonder what else was true. She slept that first week in the motel down in the county seat and drove up every morning, and then when the money got too thin even for the motel, she swept out the cot in the corner of the exchange and dragged her sleeping bag up on steps and moved in. There was no power, so she lived by lantern and the wood stove, which still drew. There was cold well water and the long blue evenings and the enormous silence of the hills, broken only by the creek and the whippoorwills, and once the dark came down, the sound of her own thoughts, which she had spent 23 years drowning out and now had no choice but to hear. She thought she would be afraid up there alone. She was not. The building did not feel empty. It felt occupied, the way a church feels occupied, by something that had been poured into it over a long time and had soaked into the wood and would not leave. She started with the roof because Odell had told her to, and because Odell was right. She had no money for a contractor, so she did what she had always done, which was to learn the thing herself. She drove down to the lumber yard in the county seat with the last of her cash and bought a roll of roofing felt and a box of nails and a sheet of tin to replace the worst of it, and she climbed up there on a borrowed ladder in the spring's sun with Odell holding the bottom rail, and she taught herself to lay roofing the way she had once taught herself double-entry bookkeeping. Slowly, badly at first, then better. Her first patch leaked. She did it again. By the 3rd try she had a feel for it. For the overlap in the nail line, and the rain that came that weekend stayed outside where it belonged, and she sat in the dry room that night, with the stove ticking, and felt the particular fierce pride of a woman who has stopped a leak with her own hands. She had spent her whole life being the one who waited on hold to get things fixed. She had not known, until that hollow, that she could be the one who fixed them. It was on a gray afternoon in the 3rd week, while she was clearing the last of the brush and rot away from the base of the great oak board, that she found it. She had been cleaning the cabinet, dusting decades from the brass and the named labels, when she noticed that the dust in one corner of the operator's shelf was not undisturbed after all. There was a place where the grain of dust broke, a faint smear, an arc, as if a panel had been opened and closed many times over many years until the very last time. She ran her fingers along the underside of the shelf where the smear led, and she felt a seam, and then a small brass catch worn smooth, the kind of catch a person finds with their thumb in the dark 1,000 times, until they no longer have to look. She pressed it. A narrow door swung open in the side of the cabinet. a hidden compartment built into the body of the board itself, between the working of the machine and the wall, a space no repairman would ever open, and no thief would ever find, because no thief would ever think a dead switchboard had anything worth hiding. And it did not by the measure of thieves. There was no gold in it, there was no jewelry. There was a coffee tin, rusted at the seams, and behind the tin, standing on their spines, a row of ledgers. Account books, 11 of them bound in black cloth gone soft and gray at the corners, each one labeled on the spine in the same slanting hand, a span of years. 1945 to 1950, 1951 to 1956, and on decade after decade, all the way to 1986. Faye lifted the first ledger out with both hands. Before I open it with her, let me ask you to do one small thing. If you've come this far, and if a story about a forgotten woman in a forgotten place is reaching something in you, take a second to subscribe and to tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It genuinely helps these stories find the people who need them most. Now, let's open the book with Faye. She sat down in the worn chair and set the ledger on her knees and opened it, and the lantern light fell across the first page, and she began to read, and the room around her, which she had thought was empty, filled slowly and completely with the presence of the woman who had written it. It was not an account book in the way Faye had expected, not a record of money owed and paid, though there was money in it. It was a record of calls. Every page was ruled into columns in Verna's hand, date and time and name and a few words, and the few words were what stopped Faye's breath. Because Verna had not been logging connections. She had been logging people. February 3, 1947. 2 a.m. Acock's baby, Croup, could not breathe. Rang Doc Maberry, no answer, rang again, rang the Tilsons next to him, sent Wesley over to wake him. Doc up the hollow by 3. Baby breathing by dawn. Stayed on the line with Della Acox the whole time so she would not be alone. Left the cord in. Faye read it twice. Left the cord in. She did not know yet what it meant. She turned the page. November 19, 1951. Ice on the wires. Half the hollow dark. Old Mrs. Penn alone at the head of Caney with no wood split and the temperature dropping. Could not raise anyone. Walked it myself after my shift 2 miles. Split her a week of wood by lantern, walked back, was on the board by 5 for the milk truck calls. Nobody to leave the cord with, so I left the door open. March 1956, Janelle's line, he has been hurting her again. She rings me at night and does not say anything. Just breathes, because if she says anything he will know. So we have a way now. She rings twice and hangs up if she is all right. 3 rings if she needs her sister sent for. 4 rings if it is bad and she has to get out tonight. She has never rung 4 before. Tonight she rang 4 times. Sent Royce's father with the truck. She is at her sister's now. The cord stays in for Janelle. Always. Faye sat very still. The lantern hissed. Outside, the whippoorwills had started, and the creek went on the way it had gone on for 10,000 years, and inside by its small light, a 49-year-old woman who had been left with $317 was reading the secret history of a woman the family had called cold. Page after page after page, 41 years of it. A whole hollow, a whole human community, held together at 3 in the morning by one woman in a chair with a board of brass holes and a rule she had made for herself and never once broken. Leave the cord in. She understood it now. On a switchboard, when a call was finished, the operator pulled the cord, broke the connection, and moved on. Pulling the cord was efficiency. Pulling the cord was the job. And Verna's rule, the rule she wrote again and again across 41 years, was the opposite of efficiency. It was, do not break the connection. When the lonely widower called pretending he needed the time, and then kept talking because the sound of another human voice was the only warmth in his house, you did not pull the cord. You left it in. You let him talk. You said, I'm here. Take your time. The line's not busy, until he had said the thing he needed to say or had simply not been alone for an hour. When the frightened woman rang and could not speak, you left the cord in. When the boy ran away and called from the store at the county line not knowing what else to do, you left the cord in and you kept him on it until somebody who loved him could come. Verna had taken the one rule of her job, disconnect, and she had inverted it into the rule of her life. Stay connected. Do not hang up on a soul in trouble. Leave the cord in. The money was in the tin. Faye opened it last, after she had read until her eyes burned. It held cash, old bills mostly, and a single sheet of paper in Verna's hand folded once, and the sheet of paper was a kind of will of its own, written years before the legal will. It said, "This is the line fund. For many years, when a family in this hollow could not pay their telephone bill, I paid it for them, out of my own wages, so that their line would not be cut. A telephone is not a luxury here. A telephone is the difference between a doctor in time and a doctor too late. I will not have a child die in this hollow, for the want of $3.85 a month. I never told anyone whose bill I paid, because charity that asks to be seen is not charity, it is a kind of pride. After I am gone, there will be no operator, but there will still be people who fall behind on what keeps them connected to help. Whoever finds this money, this is what it is for. Keep someone connected, leave the cord in. The tin held $4,180. It was not a fortune. It was 41 years of a single woman's careful saving, set aside not for herself and not for any heir, but to keep poor strangers connected to the world, after she was no longer there to do it herself. Faye sat with the tin in her lap, and the ledgers around her, and the lantern burning down, and she cried for the first time since the night she left Lonnie, but it was not the same crying. It was the crying you do when something you thought was lost turns out to have been there the whole time, just farther back than you could see. She cried for Verna, whom the family had thrown away. She cried for the man at the bus stop in the rain whose name she never knew. She cried, a little, for herself, for the woman who had spent 23 years leaving the cord in for a man who had pulled it on her every single night. And somewhere in the crying, the grief turned over and became something else, the way it sometimes does in the small hours. And she knew with a certainty that frightened her that she was not going to sell this place to the county for the tax write-off and drive back to her room above the laundromat. She was going to stay. She did not know yet how she would live or what she would do, or how a woman with nothing could keep a ruined building in a dying hollow. She knew only that she had found, at the bottom of her life, the one thing she had been looking for without ever having a name for it, which was a reason. Verna had left her a reason. She is the one who will understand. Faye understood now. She understood completely. The word got out the way everything gets out in a small place, which is to say, slowly and then all at once. Royce mentioned to someone that Verna's girl was up at the exchange and meant to keep it, and within a week they began to come. Not all at once. The hollow did not do anything all at once. They came 1 and 2 at a time, in the evenings, parking their trucks in the gravel and standing at the bottom of the stone steps with their hats in their hands, and they came to tell her things, and what they told her, one after another, filled in the rest of the ledger, the part Verna had been too modest to write. The first was a heavy-set man in his 60s with kind eyes, who introduced himself as Calvin Stiles and then could not for a moment say anything else. When he found his voice, he told her that he was alive because of Verna, that he had been born in an ice storm in 1957, breach, his mother bleeding, the roads closed, the doctor 7 miles off on the far side of a flooded ford, that his father had cranked the phone in a panic, and Verna had answered, and Verna had not just rung the doctor. She had figured out, while she had them both on the line, that the Ford was the problem, and she had rung the Boatwright brothers, who had the only truck in the hollow that could take the high water, and she had stayed on the line, all 3 parties patched together, the father and the doctor and the brothers, coordinating them like a woman conducting an orchestra in the dark, until the doctor was across the ford and up the hollow and Calvin Stiles was born alive on his mother's bed at 4 in the morning. Verna had a name for me before my own mother did, he said. She had me in her book. He had brought the book to show her, his own family Bible, and tucked in the front of it, kept for 66 years, was a card in Verna's slanting hand that said only, "A boy. Welcome, Calvin. The line was never busy for you." Then came Janelle, who was old now, who walked with a cane, who sat on the porch step and looked out over the hollow for a long time before she spoke. She told Faye about the rings. 2 for all right, 3 for help, 4 for come now. She told her how Verna had invented that code with her one night across the wire, a private language for a woman who could not speak her own danger out loud, and how Verna had kept the cord in year after year, never once telling a soul, never once letting it slip, until the night Janelle rang 4 times and got out for good. "You have to understand," Janelle said. "In those days there was no number you called. There was no shelter. There was no word for what was happening to me. There was only Verna on the other end of the wire, in the middle of the night, deciding that a woman's life was worth more than the rule that said pull the cord and move on. She saved me with a telephone and a code we made up in the dark. The family called her cold." Janelle shook her head slowly. "They never sat on the other end of that wire at 3 in the morning. I did. They kept coming. Burl Acox, whose family Verna had warned the night Caney Creek came up in the flood of '82, rung every house in the bottomland in time for them to drive a stock and the children to high ground, and not a soul lost, because one woman could see the weather coming over the ridge of her window above, and would not go to bed until she knew they were safe. The Frawley woman, Glenda, who had been Verna's relief operator for a few years in the '70s and who could explain the board to Faye, who sat down in the worn chair and showed her, with hands that remembered, how the lamp lit when a line rang, how you answered, "Number please," how you took the front cord and plugged it into the calling line, and the back cord into the called line and threw the key to ring them. And then, and this was the part Glenda's voice broke on, then you were supposed to pull both cords when they hung up. But Verna, Glenda said, Verna taught me different. Verna said the cord is not just a wire, child. The cord is the promise that somebody is still there. Some nights the only thing keeping a person in this world is knowing the operator is awake and the line is open. And they are not finally all the way alone. So you leave the cord in, Verna said, until you are sure they are all right, even if it ties up the board. Even if the rule says don't, you leave the cord in. It was Glenda, too, who gave Faye the education she had been hungry for without knowing it, the history of the thing she had inherited. She told her how, before automatic dialing, every call in country like this passed through a human being, how the operator was the original switch, the literal connection between one person and another. How in places like Pell Hollow, deep in the hills, the exchange held on long after the cities went to dial, because the company decided it was not worth the cost of running new equipment up a hollow with 150 souls in it. And so a few tiny rural exchanges in America kept a live operator at a cord board right up into the 1980s, the very last of a vanished world. Pell Hollow's board was cut over to direct dial in 1986, one of the last manual exchanges in the whole country. And the day they cut it over, Glenda said the company gave Verna a certificate and a wristwatch and turned the board off. And Verna asked if she could keep the board, the dead machine, and they said sure. Lady, it's scrap, and she paid to have it left in the building. And she came back to that dark room every day for years afterward and dusted it and folded the blanket and kept the cords in their rows, because, Glenda said, she could not stand for the place where she had kept everyone connected to itself, become a place where no one came. One evening, Glenda sat her down in the worn chair and taught her to work the board, or to work the ghost of it, since the lines were dead, and Faye learned more about her great-aunt in that 1 hour than the family had told her in 40 years. This was a party line exchange, Glenda explained, which meant most of the lines were shared, 4 or 5 or even 8 households, strung along a single wire, and the only way to know whose phone was meant to ring was the pattern. Each home had its own code, 1 long and 2 short for the Acox place, 2 long for the Pens at the head of Caney, 3 short for the parsonage. The operator did not dial a number. She rang a rhythm, working the ringing key with her right hand in a private music that the whole hollow knew by heart, so that a woman cooking supper could tell, from the pattern coming down the wire, whether the call was for her or for a neighbor 3 farms over. And because the line was shared, Glenda said, lowering her voice as if Verna might, anybody on it could lift the receiver and listen in, and most everybody did, which meant the operator was the one soul in the hollow who heard everything, and was trusted to repeat nothing. Verna knew every secret in this valley, Glenda said, every feud, every debt, every sickness, every shame. She carried all of it for 41 years, and she never once used a word of it against a living person. That is a kind of strength most people never even get tested for. Faye sat with her hands on the cords, feeling the worn brass of the plugs, the small weight of them, and she understood that she was holding the instrument of the most discreet and faithful person the hollow had ever known. A woman who had been handed everyone's private life and had simply, gently, kept it safe. And it was Glenda, finally, who told Faye the story behind the note Odell had handed her that first evening, the 4-block letters that had cracked open the family's lie. Verna saved my life. She told it slowly, watching the old man through the window where he was sweeping the steps in the last of the light, because she said he could not hear it and would not want the fuss, but Faye ought to know. Odell had lost his hearing as a boy, a fever, the kind of thing that happened in the hollows before there was a doctor close enough to matter. And he had grown up in a valley where every emergency, every warning, every call for help traveled by a sound he could not hear, a telephone he could not use, a bell that rang into a silence only he lived in. In a place like this, Glenda said, a deaf man was the one person outside the web. The flood warning came by phone and he did not hear it. The fire bell rang and he did not hear it. If his own chimney caught in the night, nobody could ring him, and he could ring nobody. He lived alone up a far hollow, the loneliest cut-off soul in a country of cut-off souls, and everyone had simply accepted it, the way people accept the things they cannot fix. Everyone except Verna, who could not stand that there was one person in her valley she could not reach. So she fixed it. She had the Boatwright brothers run a line up to Odell's cabin, and instead of a bell at the end of it, she had them wire a lamp, a bright bulb on the wall above his table, so that when Verna rang his line the lamp would flash instead of ring, and a deaf man, for the first time in his life, could be called. She gave him a code of her own, the way she had given Janelle a code. A slow, steady flashing meant come down, you are needed. A fast, urgent flashing meant danger, get out, get to high ground. And she gave him, along with the lamp, the thing he had never had in his whole silent life, which was a job, a place in the web. When the roads were bad, and somebody up a far hollow needed a person sent in the night, Verna would flash Odell's lamp, and the deaf man would come down the dark gravel to the exchange, and she would hand him a written note to carry, and he would carry it, her legs where her voice could not go, and for 30 years the operator who could not leave her chair, the runner who could not hear, were a single creature that kept the whole valley stitched together. He was her hands, she was his ears. Neither of them was alone anymore, because each had found the one other person who needed exactly what they had to give. And the night she saved his life, Glenda said, was the winter his mother died, the last person in the world who had been his, and Odell had gone up to that cabin and let the fire go out and not lit it again, and had sat in the cold and the silence and decided, the way a person decides in the worst hour, that there was no reason to go on being the one cut-off man in the hollow. Verna could see his chimney from her window above the board. She watched the smoke of every house in the valley out of long habit, the way she watched the weather, and on the second morning with no smoke from Odell's chimney in a killing cold. She knew. She rang his lamp, she flashed it slow, come down, you are needed, again and again all that gray morning, and he sat in the cold and watched it flash and did not move. So she did the only thing left. She flashed the danger code, the fast, urgent flashing, get out, get out, get out. One signal a body cannot ignore, the signal wired into him over 30 years, and his hands moved before his grief could stop them, and he got up and got out. And on the step of his cold cabin he found that there was no fire, no flood, no danger, nothing but the empty white morning, and a lamp behind him still flashing its lie. And he understood. He understood that the only danger in the hollow that morning had been him, and that the one person left in the world who had noticed he was gone, who had counted his chimney smoke, who could not stand to lose a single soul off her board, had reached up a dead winter hollow with a flashing light and pulled him back into the land of the living by the one cord he had. She left the cord in for a man who could not hear it ring. After that, Glenda said, Odell never let her down, and he never let the building down, and when Verna got too old to climb the hill he started sweeping the steps himself every evening, keeping the place ready, because Verna had told him, in the written notes that were their whole shared language, that someday somebody would come for it. And Odell had decided that when that somebody came, the steps would be clean. Faye listened to all of it. And as she listened, the woman called Verna assembled herself out of all those voices into a person, a real and complete person, nothing like the cardboard villain of the family stories. A woman who had not chosen a switchboard over a family. A woman who had made a whole hollow her family, quietly, in the dark, $3.85 and a left-in cord at a time, and asked nothing back, and let her own blood relations call her cold, rather than explain herself, because charity that asks to be seen is a kind of pride. Faye understood finally why Verna had left it all to her. Not because Verna had known her, because Verna had recognized her. Across the whole distance of a family and a lifetime, the old operator had somehow known that there was, down at the far end of the line, a quiet woman who spent her life leaving the cord in for people who would never thank her and who would understand, but she was 3 months into the work and just beginning, to believe she could make a life there when the black SUV came up the hollow. It was a clean machine, German, The kind of vehicle that has never seen mud until it comes looking for it, and it came up the gravel road too fast and stopped in the exchange's lot at an angle, and a man got out who did not belong to the Hollow in any way the Hollow recognized. He was younger than Faye, in good gray slacks and a quarter zip, with a small embroidered logo over the heart, and he had very white teeth and a leather folder under his arm, and the particular brisk warmth of a man who has been trained to seem like your friend for exactly as long as it takes. He looked at the building the way a butcher looks at a steer. He looked at Faye the way he looked at the building. His name, he said, extending a hand, was Garrett Maddox, and he was a site acquisition representative for a company called Sable Ridge Infrastructure Partners, and he had, he said, some very good news for her. The good news, it emerged over the next 20 minutes on the sagging porch, was that Faye was sitting on the single most valuable piece of dirt in 3 counties, and she didn't even know it. Not the building, Maddox said, with a small dismissive wave at the stone and clapboard behind her. That thing's a liability. That thing's a teardown. You've got a condemnation hanging over you whether you know it or not. The land, the rise, the one spot in the whole hollow with clean line of sight to every ridge. Sable Ridge needed exactly that geometry for a telecommunications tower. A relay, part of a regional broadband build-out, very exciting, federal money behind it, bringing the future to underserved rural communities, and Faye's little hilltop was, by happy accident, the perfect spot. They were prepared, Maddox said, opening the leather folder, to make her a generous offer. He slid a single sheet across the porch rail. $48,000. Faye looked at the number. $48,000. To a woman with $317 to her name, it was not a number. It was another planet. It was a down payment on a normal life. It was a car that started in winter and a small place of her own, and an end to the arithmetic of fear that had run in the back of her mind for months. She felt the pull of it, the simple animal pull of it, and she let herself feel it, standing there on the porch in the spring evening with the man's white teeth shining at her. And then Maddox, who could not help himself, who had closed 100 of these deals, and had stopped seeing the people on the other end of them as people, kept talking. He gestured again at the building, and he said the line that decided everything. He said, and honestly, between you and me, the copper alone in that old switchboard's worth a few thousand at scrap, so you're really getting paid twice. We'll haul the whole works to the recyclers, melt it down, and you'll never have to think about it again. Clean slate, the copper. He wanted to rip the atoms out of Verna's board, the cords she had left in for 41 years, and melt them down for scrap. He wanted to take the one machine in the world that had kept this hollow connected, and sell the metal of it by the pound, and put a tower on the hill that would beam connection down to the same people and bill them $39.95 a month for it. The irony of it was so total, so perfect, that Faye almost laughed. A woman had spent her life keeping these people connected for nothing, out of her own wages, leaving the cord in. And here was a man who would tear out that copper and sell connection back to them, and call it the future, and call it good news. Something happened in Faye that had not happened in 23 years, maybe not in her whole life. She stopped going small. No, she said. Maddox smiled the patient smile. I know it's a lot to take in. Sleep on it. Renfro, and I say this as a friend, you don't have a lot of leverage here. That building's already flagged for condemnation. The county wants it gone. If you don't sell, there's a real good chance you end up with no building and no check. This way you walk away whole. He tapped the paper on the rail. 48. That's not an opening number, that's a favor. I said no, Faye said, and I want you off this hill. Maddox's smile cooled by a few degrees and the friend went out of it, and what was left was the thing that had always been underneath. He picked up his folder. He said something about how she should really talk to a lawyer before she did something she'd regret, that emotional decisions and real estate didn't mix, that he'd be in touch, that the county's patience and his company's patience were not infinite. Then he got back in the clean black machine and went down the hollow too fast, and the dust of him hung in the gold evening air for a long time after he was gone. Faye stood on the porch and watched the dust settle and felt her heart going hard, and underneath the fear, a thing she had not felt in so long she barely recognized it. Anger. Clean, clarifying, righteous anger. On behalf of a dead woman and a tin of left-in cords, she was afraid. Maddox was right that she had no leverage. She had $317, and a condemnation flag and a building the county wanted gone, and a man with a folder full of money and lawyers behind him, and every story she had ever lived told her how this ended. The quiet ones lost. The ones who left the cord in got the cord pulled on them. She knew that story by heart. She had been living inside it for 49 years. But she also had 11 ledgers and a tin and a will, and she had spent 23 years keeping books, and she knew that the most important entry is sometimes the one nobody bothered to look for. So before she let herself be afraid, before she let Maddox's words settle into the old groove of her fear, she went back inside to the great oak board, and she took out the 11 ledgers and the tin and the will and the legal letter, and she spread them all out on the operator's shelf in the lantern light, and she did the thing she had always been best at. She read the books, all of them, every page, every margin, every folded sheet tucked between the leaves. She read until the lantern guttered and she lit another, and somewhere past midnight in the back of the very last ledger, the one that ran out in 1986 when they cut the board to dial, behind a page that had been carefully glued to its neighbor so that the two read as one, unless you held them to the light. Faye Renfro found the thing that Verna May Renfro had hidden for the person who would understand. Before I tell you what was on that page, let me say one more time, because we're at the part of the story that matters most. If this story is reaching you, if Verna's left-in cord is reaching you, take 1 second to subscribe and to tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. These stories live or die by whether they get passed along. All right, here is what Faye found behind the glued page. It was a legal document, a photostat, gone amber at the edges, of a recorded deed, and reading it by lantern light at 1 in the morning, Faye, who had kept books for a heating and cooling man for 23 years and knew exactly what she was looking at, understood that the cold old woman the family had thrown away had reached forward across more than 30 years and set a trap for the kind of man who had stood on her porch. That evening, with his white teeth and his folder full of money. In 1989, 3 years after they cut the board to dial, Verna had done something. She had not just kept the dead building. She had taken the deed to the exchange and the rise it stood on, and she had placed it, in perpetuity, under a conservation and historic preservation easement granted to and held by the Ozark Heritage Trust, a real and standing nonprofit in the county seat, an easement recorded in the courthouse and binding on the land itself and on every future owner of it forever. The easement did 2 things, and it did them with the quiet, absolute force of a thing that has been law for 35 years. First, it forbade the demolition or material alteration of the exchange building, which was named in the document as a site of historic significance, the last manual telephone exchange in the district. And second, in language Faye read 3 times because she could not believe a country switchboard operator had been this far ahead of a corporate landman, it forbade in perpetuity the construction of any commercial transmission, broadcast, or telecommunication structure upon the parcel. No tower, not now, not ever, not by Faye, not by the county, not by Sable Ridge, not by anyone. Verna had seen it coming, not the specific man, not the specific company, but the shape of it. She had understood in 1989, sitting in her dark room with her dead board, that one day the most valuable thing about her hilltop would be the very thing that had made it perfect for her work. That clear line of sight to every soul in the hollow, and that one day a man would come up the gravel road and want to put a tower there and tear out the copper and call it the future. And she had reached into that future and tied its hands. She had left the cord in for a hollow she would never see. There was a clause, too, the kind of clause as that makes a county clerk go pale. The condemnation Maddox had been waving around, the county's flag on the building, ran straight into the easement and stopped dead. You cannot condemn for demolition a structure that a recorded perpetual easement forbids you to demolish. The county had been carrying a tax problem they could not actually solve, which was exactly why Royce had said they'd be glad to be shut of it, and exactly why nobody from outside had ever been able to do anything with the hilltop, no matter how perfect it looked on a map. The land could be owned, it could be lived on, it could be loved and kept and restored, but it could never ever be a tower, and it could never be torn down. Faye sat back in the worn chair in the small hours and laughed. Finally, the laugh she had swallowed on the porch, except now it had tears in it. The quiet woman had not lost. 35 years dead in the future, and Verna had not lost. She had simply, in her patient and invisible way, left the cord in. when Garrett Maddox came back up the hollow, and he did come back 2 weeks later with a different smile and a thicker folder, and a number that had grown to $71,000. Faye Renfro met him on the porch with the easement in her hand. She did not raise her voice. She had never been a woman who raised her voice. She let him make his pitch, the sweetened offer, the gentle threats, the talk of the county's patience running out, and when he was finished she handed him the photostat and let him read it. She watched his face while he read, watched the friend go out of it, and then the salesman going out of it, and then, at the bottom, the last thing go out of it, which was the certainty that money won. He read it twice. He took out his phone and read a number off it to someone who did not pick up. He looked up at the great oak board through the window, with its hundreds of named brass holes, all that worthless copper, all that priceless connection. And Faye watched him understand that there was no tower here, that there had never been a tower here, that a woman who had earned a country operator's wage had outlaw-lawyered a company with a federal contract from beyond the grave, for free, out of nothing but foresight and love. He did not have anything to say. Men like Maddox almost never do, when the thing they cannot put a price on finally stops them, because they have spent their whole lives believing that everything has a price, and the believing has made them small. He folded his thick folder back up. He went down the steps and got into the clean black machine, and went down the hollow, slower this time, and he did not come back. Faye stood on the porch and watched the dust settle one last time, and beside her, because it was evening, old Odell stood leaning on his broom, and though he had not heard a single word that passed between them, he had read the whole thing in their faces, and he was smiling his undefended smile. And he reached over and patted Faye twice on the shoulder, gently, the way you pat someone who has done a hard and right thing, and then he went back to sweeping the steps that did not need sweeping. Faye stayed. The line fund money fixed the worst of the roof and the porch and put new glass in the cracked windows and got the power turned back on, and the hollow did the rest, the way the hollow did everything, slowly and without being asked. Calvin Stiles, who turned out to be a fair hand with stone, rebuilt the failed corner of the porch. The Boatwright nephew, last of the family whose truck had crossed the flooded ford the night Calvin was born, rewired the building to code for nothing but the cost of the parts and a standing pot of coffee. Glenda Frawley came up 2 evenings a week, and the 2 women cleaned the great oak board together, brass hole by brass hole, name by name, the living and the dead, Acox and Stiles and Maberry and Penn, until it gleamed in the lamplight like something holy. Janelle planted a row of irises along the stone foundation. Verna's flower, she said, the only thing the old woman ever asked anybody to grow for her, and they came up the next spring purple and white against the gray stone, and bloomed. Faye did not turn the exchange back into a switchboard, because the world had moved on, and you cannot bring back a vanished thing. But she did not let it be a museum, either. A dead place behind glass, because Verna would not have stood for that, and because the easement, in its careful third clause, named the building a site for the gathering and benefit of the community in perpetuity. So Faye made it a kind of room for the hollow. She kept the coffee on the wood stove the way Verna had kept it for the milk truck drivers, and the door was never locked, and any soul who came up the gravel road could come in and sit and have a cup and be for an hour, not alone. The lonely came, and the old came, and on bad nights the frightened came, because word gets out in a small place, and the word that got out was that the light was on again up at the old exchange, and that the woman who lived there now would leave the cord in. She started the line fund again, the real one, with the money that was left and with the small things people pressed on her. A jar of honey, a folded bill in a tin, the way they had once pressed them on Verna. It was not for telephone bills anymore. Nobody's life turned on $3.85 now. But there were power bills in January, and gas to get to the doctor in the county seat, and a child who needed shoes, and Faye kept a ledger, a new black cloth ledger she bought at the dollar store and labeled on the spine in her own hand, and she paid what she could quietly, telling no one, because charity that asks to be seen is a kind of pride. She had learned that from a woman she had met once on a porch when she was 6 years old and could not remember. The first hard test of it came in January. On a night, the temperature fell below 0, and the wind came down off the ridge with teeth in it. Faye was banking the stove for the night when headlights swung wild across the front windows, too fast for the gravel, and a truck slid to a stop in the lot at a bad angle, and a young man got out, maybe 22, maybe 23, bareheaded in the cold, with a particular stillness in him that Faye recognized because she had carried it herself once in a motel room with her shoes on. He had seen the light on. That was all he could say at first. He had been driving the back roads for 2 hours with nowhere but to be, and no reason he could name to keep going, and he had seen the one lit window in a dark hollow, and he had turned up the gravel toward it the way a moth turns, without deciding to. He stood on her porch and could not make himself come in and could not make himself leave. Faye did not ask him what was wrong. She had learned, from a ledger and from her own life, that the worst thing you can do to a person in that particular dark is make them explain themselves before they are ready. She just opened the door wider and said the coffee was hot and the stove was warm and he was welcome to either or both, and then she went back to banking the fire and let him decide, because a door held open is a kind of cord left in and you do not pull it, you wait. After a while he came in. He sat in the green chair by the stove with a mug he did not drink from, and Faye sat in the operator's chair by the window, and for a long time neither of them said anything at all, and the not saying was the whole gift of it. The wind worked at the eaves. The stove ticked. Somewhere down the hollow a dog barked once at the cold and gave it up. He talked, eventually, the way they always do once they understand that the listening is real, and the clock is not running. It came out in pieces, the job that had ended, and the girl who had left, and the father he could not please, and the long arithmetic of feeling like a burden that he, too, had been adding up in the dark. Faye did not fix any of it, because none of it was hers to fix, and because she had learned that people do not need their grief solved at 2 a.m, they need it witnessed. She just kept the cord in. She kept the coffee warm and the stove fed and her chair by the window, and she stayed awake with him until the black outside the glass went gray, and then the gray went gold over the ridge, and somewhere in there the thing in him that had been driving toward the edge turned quietly, the way her own grief had once turned on a motel ceiling, and pointed back toward living. He left after sunup. He shook her hand at the door and could not quite meet her eyes, and said he would be all right now, and she believed him because she had once said the same thing to herself and made it true. She never learned his last name. She wrote the night down in her ledger anyway. A young man, cold, lost. Left the cord in. He drove off toward home. She thought, watching his taillights go down the gravel, about the man at the bus stop in the rain all those years ago, the one whose name she had also never learned, the one she had stood with until the rain let up. She understood now that she had been an operator her whole life without a board, that she had been leaving the cord in for strangers since long before she knew there was a word for it, or a chair for it, or a dead great-aunt who had spent 41 years doing the same thing in the same hills. Verna had not taught her this. Verna had only given her the room to finally know that she had always been this. That was the inheritance, not the building, the recognition. She wrote in the ledger every night before she slept, by the same window above the board where Verna had watched weather come over the ridge for 41 years. She wrote the date and the name and a few words, and on the night she made the very first entry in her own hand, she did a thing she had been waiting to do, a thing that felt like the closing of a circle that had been open for 100 years. She took down the last of Verna's 11 ledgers, the one that ran out in 1986, and she turned to the final page, the last entry the old operator had ever made on the last day the board was alive, and below it, in the empty space underneath, in her own steady hand, Faye Renfro wrote her own name and the date and these words. Picked up the line again today. It was never really hung up. And then she signed it, and she put both ledgers, Verna's and her own, back into the hidden compartment in the body of the board, side by side, where the next person who understood would one day find them. That is the thing about a switchboard. It looks to a man with a folder like a dead machine full of scrap copper. It looks to a county assessor with a deadline like a zero. But a switchboard was never really a machine. It was a chair and a window and one human being who decided 10,000 nights in a row that the rule which said pull the cord and move on was a rule worth breaking, because on the other end of every wire was a person who needed, more than anything, to know that someone's was still there. The technology dies, the cords go to scrap, but the decision, the daily ordinary decision to stay on the line with a soul in trouble, that does not die. It just waits, the way the building waited, the way the hidden ledgers waited, for the next quiet person who will sit down in the worn chair and put their hands in the worn places and understand. Faye Renfro was 49 years old, and she had been left with $317 and the wreckage of 23 years. And a man had offered her $71,000 to tear out the copper and walk away whole. She had said no. It was the richest no of her life. Because what Verna left her in the end was not a building and not a tin of money, and not even a clever easement that beat a corporation from beyond the grave. What Verna left her was the understanding that a legacy is not the things you keep. A legacy is the connections you refuse to break. It is a ledger full of names. It is a coffeepot kept warm for whoever comes up the road. It is the cord you leave in on the cold nights, the people the world has stopped answering. The light is on up at the old exchange in Pell Hollow. The door is not locked. The coffee is warm. And if you ever come up the gravel road in the dark, lost or tired, or just needing to not be alone for an hour, there is a quiet woman in a chair by the window who will not pull the cord. She will leave it in. She learned it from a woman she met when she was 6. Some promises take 50 years to keep. If this story reached you tonight, do one thing for someone before you sleep. Call the person you keep meaning to call. Leave the cord in. And if you'd like more stories like this one, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it, and tell us in the comments, who is the quiet person in your life who left the cord in for you? We read everyone. We'll see you up the road.